In this project, I'm going to be showing you how to make it look like your character is balancing on top of an object. We could take any object in the game and have our character change their idle stance to be able to look like they're balancing. If I jump onto this pole, you'll see that there's a 2 feet balance animation. And if I'm on this other pole, it's 1 foot. And regardless of what geometry I'm jumping on top of, colliding with an object in the game is telling me that I can attach to it, pivot around it, and change the animation. Then when we're done, set our animation back to the default idle. So, let's see what's involved in this process. Alright, starting off with a third-person template here, what we want to do is add our actor into the level that's going to handle our overlap. So we're just going to set a simple sphere collision as an actor, and when we place that on top of any object, that's what our character is going to do a trace for, to be able to determine whether or not we can balance on top of it. So in the content drawer, just right click anywhere, go to blueprint class, and we're going to select actor. I'm going to name this BP underscore balance point. When we open it up, add the sphere component, here collision. And we just want to change the radius so it's a bit smaller. I'm going to start off with just using a radius of 3 rather than 32. File and save. And so the idea behind this is going into our level. I'm going to just drag in our actor. And I'm going to create a simple cylinder to act as a pole. Just reduce the scaling here. It actually looks like one. And we want our character to just be able to land on top of it. And ideally, what I found works the best is if we have our sphere collision half overlapping the top of our object. You may have to mess with that given if you use a custom mesh. But for the purposes of this demo, since we're just using Manny, that's what I'm going to do. So now when we do a trace for this, we want to make sure that we're only hitting the sphere collision, not anything else. There's a couple ways to do that, but by far the easiest way is to make a new trace channel. If you go to Edit, Project Settings, and it's going to be under Engine and Collision. Go to New Trace Channel, and I'm going to call this Balance Point. And we want to make sure that it is set to Ignore by default, because if you start placing geometry into your map, we don't want it to set true for any trace that we do for balancing. So going back to our blueprint for the sphere, we could just type in collision in the search box, and we want to change from overlap all dynamic to custom, and we want to make sure that our trace channel we have to recompile it and just set it to block. File again, save it. Now we can open up our third-person character. Now I moved the jump input action up to the top because we're going to have to edit that. But otherwise, this is the stock code that comes with the mannequin. And we're going to create a new event. And to start off, I'm just going to have this event on tick, and I'll show you how to move it to a timer later. The event that we're going to do, the custom event that we're just going to call balance. Now you can use a sphere trace, you can use a capsule trace, whichever. The idea is that we're going to have a small area around and below our feet, so then our actor is searching for a balance point. So we're going to start off with just a sphere trace, a channel, and I'm going to set the radius to something like 40. And the start and end location is going to be the same. it's going to be our actor location. Minus, subtract, 100 on the z-axis. Change the trace channel to the balance point channel that we just made. To show persistent debug, I'm going to switch to the new editor window, so this just has a pop-out. This is roughly where we're going to be tracing. So when it overlaps with this, we see it's green, we're going to snap to this location. So the first thing that I want to do is change this so then it's not triggering the sphere trace unless we're falling, but if we're actually falling. So not using the is falling node. We're going to check to see if our z velocity is less than 0. We can get our character movement, drag off and get velocity, split the velocity pin, and is z less than 0. Put a branch here, and if that's true, then we do the sphere trace. Exactly like that. So now if we do hit this, essentially what we want to do is set the actor's location. Now, since we only want to do this if we hit, we connect the branch, and we are going to break our out hit pin. And the location that we're going to set this to is going to be the hit actor, which is our balance point. You can drag off of hit actor, get actor location. Now, if we just plug this in right as it is, our character is not going to go on top of our hole that we made. The reason why is because when we have get actor location, it is going to assign it to the pelvis area of Manny. So if we were just to do this and overlap, it's going to shunt us off exactly like that, even though it recognizes the hit. We have to adjust the height. Now, since it's about halfway up the mesh, and the mesh is pretty much the height of the capsule, there is a capsule component half height that we can see here. Change it, is at 90. So regardless of what skeleton you use, maybe use a bigger mesh, maybe you have an altered skeleton or using a different capsule component entirely, we can just add the capsule half height to our actor's location, and then it should adjust it so then our feet are going to be on top of our pole at the very center of that balance point. I'm going to drag off and get add. Get our capsule component. Get our half height. And we can change this to a... You can either split it, or you can make a vector out of this. We just want the z value here. Then set our location there. Now when we overlap, our character attaches to it. So a couple things that we need to do. Number one is that we want our character to not be able to just walk off of this. And if I'm going slow, you can see it's starting to immediately reattach itself because it is doing a trace as soon as we fall off. So in order of what we want to do, we are going to get our character's movement. And the first thing we're going to do is stop our character movement immediately. The reason why is because even though we changed the location, our character still keeps momentum. So it could attach to it, and even if we change the movement mode, it'd still slide off of it. So stop movement immediately. It's going to be our first pin. And now if we wanted to change the movement mode, it's dependent on what you want to do in your game. set movement mode. If you set movement to none, that will do exactly what we want it to do. Now we can't move our character. We can have it so then we can jump and then still move, but the problem is that we can't pivot around. I do want my character to be able to pivot around. So I'm going to change the movement mode to flying. You can also set it to walking if you want, but depending on what you want to do, that may not be the best option. That use case isn't going to be covered, so I'm just going to be using flying since very likely you're not going to be using that unless, say, while running. So we want things that don't overlap as much as possible. Now that we set this to flying, we also need to set our max fly speed to 0 so then we don't immediately move off of it. Because once we set it to flying, that's what happens. Our character slides around. So set max fly speed. And we just leave that at 0. And now we can rotate our character around. Very, I think, old PS2 era of doing things, but Assassin's Creed also does that, so that's kind of the inspiration for this, and that's what I'm going to keep it as. Now, the next thing that we can handle, in no particular order, is getting our idle animation to play when we are on the balance point. So we can, if you have one animation, have a variable to just flag when our character is on our balance point and uncheck it when it isn't. We can create a Boolean value, and I'm going to call it on point. And we are going to set this as true after we are at our location. If we open up our animation blueprint, okay, so very simply, if we want to gain access to our variables here, we can cast a third-person blueprint. You can also change this cast a character to cast to your third-person character, since character is a parent class. Everything that you have access to in here is also accessible here. Since this is the character's animation blueprint, we could just right-click and convert to pure cast, so we don't need to plug that in. And then we want to promote this to a variable. And then we drag off of here, and we can get our on point. And just simply promote this to a variable within your animation blueprint. Get to the sequencer, sequence node. And also you have to get their character. Okay, so now if we go into our anim graph and we want to change the idle animations, the stock idle here is just what comes with the third-person template. If we go down, I have a blueprint here that I'm going to be using. I have a 1 foot balance and a 2 foot balance, and I'm going to show you how to use both of these, but for right now, assuming you only have one, what we want to do is get the blend poses by bool. So our false pose is not going to be on point, so that's going to be our normal idle, and we're just going to do the 1 foot balance on true. And the on point variable is going to be our active value. Now, if we did everything right, and we are on point, can see our animation has changed. I'm still unable to move off of this point. And that is okay. Only on a variable that we will be removing shortly. Now the next steps of this is going to be to move this to a timer before we go any further. And then we are going to be removing this on point variable in favor of creating an enumeration that will tell us that we can switch between the 1 foot and 2 foot idle. The error that we were seeing before is because we don't uncheck on point at all, but the animation graph still defaults back to falling and then back to the normal idle, which is why it was still working. So we can just get rid of this. And I'm going to create a new event that's going to handle our timer, and I'm just going to call it start timer. So it's going to be a custom event. Actually, start balance, better. And we are going to set timer by event. And we want this looping, say, every 0.01 second. And the event that we're going to plug in is our balance. And we want to stop this timer. So we're going to have to create a variable out of this return value. And we could just call it balance timer. And when we want to end this, we're going to create a custom event again. We're going to call it end balance. And all we're going to do here is clear and invalidate timer by handle and plug in our balance timer. Okay, so now we need to think, when are we going to start the timer? Two things come to mind. One of which is if we are moving, we can start the timer to see if we're balancing. That way, if we walk off of something like a ledge, we'll still be able to land on top of a balance point. And if we are jumping up onto a balance point, we also want that to work as well. So we're going to set this start balance in both of those input modes. So at the very end of your IA move, we can just call start balance. And before, I'm going to do this before we jump. I don't think the order is going to matter too much, but I know we're going to have to add things between these two nodes here once we get to the enumeration. And we also want to call our end balance. And we want our balance timer to end when we overlap. That way we don't cause multiple overlaps. And that way we can go through and also exit without having it constantly set our actor location. I'm actually going to set it after the stop movement because I think that should take higher priority. And we could just say stop. Balance. And if we do jump off, we want to make sure that this timer stops when we're on the ground. So we can right click and get on event on landed. And we'll call our end balance here as well. I'm going to get rid of this poll variable now. Don't want it to keep popping up with an error. This, I'm going to create an enumerator. So I think we need to do here is if it is moving and jumping, it's calling the timer multiple times. So we are going to check to see if timer is active. Handle. Balance timer. We should want to set this to false, so it's not going to run if it is already running. Move on to our enumeration. So if we open up the content drawer, right click in free space, and we're going to type in enumeration into the search. Call it E_idols. And we're going to add 3 enumerators. First one is always going to be default because it's always good to have a default value. The other 2 are going to be what we are going to designate as 1 foot for a 1 foot animation and 2 feet for a 2 feet animation. Now we're going to close down this, but we are going to have to add this to our third person character. We're going to have to cast that to our animation blueprint, and we are also going to have to put that into our balance point actor. And depending on what we set in our actor blueprint, that's going to tell our third person character what animation to use. So we can, in our third person character and variables, add a new one. We're going to call it idols. Type E_idols or just E_idols. Then we can open up our balance point blueprint and select your sphere component, go all the way to the bottom of the list to on component begin overlap. And we're going to cast this to our third person character. Other actor. And we're going to drag off third person and get our idols. So we're going to set the idol here. And the value is going to be equal to our idol that we set in our balance point. So in our balance point here, variables, go to idols, type E idols, only did that because it was originally a boolean when I added this. Why? And connect the pin here. And we want to click the eye icon here to make this editable in the level blueprint. Well, or level details here. So now if we select the balance point, we have default, 1 foot, or 2 feet. So our default animation is not going to be used, but we want to have it for the purposes of our animation graph. So we can set this to be 1 foot or 2 feet. I'm going to copy the pole and the balance point and move it over. And the first one we're going to set to 1 foot, and the other we're going to set to 2 feet. Save that in my level. Open this back up. We are done using the balance point blueprint. In our animation graph, to drag off of our third person character, we want to get our idols, promote it to a variable, connect that in here. And when we go to our idle state, we want to add the blend pose by enum node. You can only do that after you add the specific enum. So blend pose by idols. So see, it comes with a default pose, but that's not the same default pose that we set in our enumeration object. So right click anywhere in the blank space in the option menu, add 1 foot, and add 2 feet. Our default pose is going to be our idle. Connect the output animation, and we are going to drag in 1 foot and 2 feet. Connect them as so. And we are going to add our idles and connect that in here. So now when we run it, if we did not have the default pose, even though we're not using it, it's going to be reading the first value of our enumeration list, which would be 1 foot. So even though we have this set to default, it would be firing off as 1 foot balance. So that's why you always put a default in your enumeration, especially if you're using animations. Just a tip for everyone. Okay, now what we need to do, we are done with the animation blueprint now, but we're just going to test this out. Okay, that will have our 1 foot animation, and the other is going to be a 2 foot animation. To stop that error, we would need to get a validated get from our third person character. So we can just drag over the variable here, right click and convert it to validated get, and plug that in instead of the validated get for the character. File, and we should be all set. And now what we need to do is test to see which animation that we're in and handle our jump input accordingly. If I go down to jump, I'm going to, after I call start balance, we are going to check to see what we are currently idling at. So get idles and get equal. Be sure to choose equal enum. And I'm going to make a branch. And that branch is going to say if we are in the default, which again, this is a different default depending on, it's a different default than what is playing in the animation again. So this just really means if we're not in the 1 or 2 feet idle animation. So if we are at the default, we're just going to select jump off of our true branch. And if it is false, we need to change our movement mode back to walking. Set movement mode back to walking, and set our character's max fly speed back to its default, which I know is 600. Normally, if you are changing values like this, rather than hard coding it, you would want to get a temporary variable to save what it is before you change it, and then we would just set it back to whatever the temporary variable was saying. So now that we're back into walking and we set our fly speed back to normal, we can now successfully jump. And when we do jump, it's a good time to be able to set our idle back to default. That way, when we land, we don't keep the last used idle that was cast to our character. To set the idle back as default. So compile and save. Now that's our 1 foot, or 2 feet, and back to default without any errors. Now, the one thing I want to add to this is if you notice, if I'm a little bit off, my character just kind of snaps to the location, and it's a bit jarring. So one way that we can handle this is by using a timeline to transition slowly, or at least smoothly, to our set location. I'm going to right click and say add timeline, and I'm just going to name it like move to location. Double click it, add a track, float track, name it, I don't know, transition time. I'm just going to put the length as 1 second. We're going to add a key at 00. set it to 0, 0 if it's not, and then we want it to be linear, so I'm going to just go to 1, 1, try to add a key, make sure the value and time is 1 and 1, file it, save it, go back to our event graph, and so set will go into the start, and then we want to update our actor location, and the node that we're going to use for this is the interp to constant, which will take our current location and move us over to the target location. We have a delta time and a speed, where delta time is going to be the transition time. Our target location is going to be the new location that we had set from our out hit actor and our capsule height addition, and our current is going to be our current location. So get actor location, set it here, and you'll have to play around with these values a little bit. Honestly, you probably don't even need to have the timeline. You could also have a timer, just anything that ticks, so then this will update incrementally. It's going to set a interp speed of 40 to start this off with, and make sure to plug in the return value to your set actor location. So now when we overlap with it, see our character it's too slow, so our character's not able to escape. So we can set the delta time probably like a third. And type in 0.35 right this way. This is going to be largely up to your preference. I'm just trying to get something that I would be happy with, so. I don't know what would happen if I did 100. Looks a bit better. Okay, so you can fool around with the delta time and the interp speed according to what you would want to do with your own project, but that would be how we can smoothly transition rather than snapping it. And that's more for our camera, so then it doesn't look jarring to the player. But that is everything that we need to do to be able to have our character balance on a point. If you like this demo, let me know by leaving a like. If you'd like to download this project, check the description for my Patreon. Everything here has been moved to a self-contained actor component, so you can add it to your own project with minimal effort. And finally, subscribe and comment if you'd like to see any other tutorials in the future. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've been inspired.